August 12th, 1966. The suffocating 100-degree heat of Phuoc Tuy Province radiated through the dense elephant grass, baking the exhausted men of the 1st Battalion. Staff Sergeant Mike Brennan of the 503rd Infantry Regiment crouched low, his eyes stinging violently from the continuous pour of salty sweat. His platoon had been humping through this god-forsaken jungle for 6 grueling days. The physical toll was immediate and brutal. 50-kilogram rucksacks cut deep, bleeding grooves into their raw shoulders. Dehydration threatened to blur their vision, while the deafening, relentless buzz of jungle insects masked any subtle sounds of approaching danger. They were actively searching for a phantom Viet Cong battalion that military intelligence swore was operating heavily in this specific grid sector. Thus far, they had found absolutely nothing except long-abandoned villages and the frustrating remains of cold cooking fires. American military doctrine, heavily forged in the massive industrial victories of the Second World War, demanded aggressive movement. The men were trained to deliberately seek out contact, to find the hidden enemy, fix them rigidly in place, and utterly destroy them using overwhelming artillery and air support. They were currently hunting the only way they had ever been taught. Suddenly, the rhythmic crunch of boots halted. "Movement. 2 o'clock," whispered his point man, the words barely carrying over the drone of cicadas. Brennan immediately raised his clenched fist, instantly freezing the 40-man column in their tracks. M16 rifles were slowly raised to trembling shoulders, thumbs clicking safeties off in a staggered wave of metallic snaps. The movement ahead was a single Viet Cong scout, deliberately exposing himself at the distant edge of the dark tree line. This was the exact moment they had been relentlessly training for. Find the elusive enemy, fix him, and unleash hellish firepower. However, exactly 300 meters to their east, hidden perfectly within a dense stand of rotting bamboo, sat Captain Bob Milligan. As an officer of the elite Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, Milligan watched the unfolding scene through the magnification of his mud-smeared binoculars. He possessed a radically different understanding of this hostile environment. To Milligan, the lone figure standing so brazenly in the open was not a target of opportunity, but obviously a lethal piece of bait. The veteran Australian had witnessed this exact, deadly dance orchestrated by the Viet Cong a dozen bloody times before. Looking closely beyond the deceptive edge of the tree line, Milligan knew with chilling certainty that at least 24 hardened guerrillas waited silently in deeply prepared, camouflaged firing positions. They were armed with heavy machine guns and interlocking fields of fire, specifically designed to shred an advancing American infantry formation. The trap was classic and terrifyingly effective. If Brennan's exhausted platoon charged forward with their characteristic aggressive maneuvers, they would walk directly into a meticulously engineered slaughterhouse. The guerrillas would inflict massive, crippling casualties within seconds, then rapidly melt back into the impenetrable jungle before American artillery could respond. The stark contrast in tactical philosophy was playing out in real time across this tiny stretch of contested Vietnamese soil. The Americans were operating on the unquestioned assumption that their superior firepower guaranteed dominance in any engagement. They moved loudly, relying on momentum and brute force to shatter ambushes. Milligan, observing their rigid column formation, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He faced an agonizing dilemma as seconds ticked away. Should he maintain strict radio silence and preserve his team's concealed observation post, or intervene immediately to prevent an impending massacre of Allied soldiers who didn't know better? The friction of war is rarely about grand strategy. It usually manifests as a horrifyingly brief window to make a life-or-death decision while completely isolated. Milligan's thumb hovered nervously over the transmit button of his heavy PRC 7-7 radio. He knew that breaking squelch would instantly alert the hidden Viet Cong network to the presence of his own small, vulnerable reconnaissance element. Yet, watching Brennan's point man begin to shift his weight forward, preparing to initiate the doomed assault, the Australian captain understood that tactical doctrine could never outweigh the immediate, moral imperative to save those 40 oblivious lives. "Sunray, this is Dingo 2. Halt your current advance immediately," Milligan whispered harshly into the handset, the sudden radio crackle startling Brennan's radio operator. Brennan paused, his hand still suspended in the thick, humid air, confusion warring with his ingrained aggressive instincts. You have a reinforced Charlie element waiting in the dark timber directly ahead of your axis of advance. The Australian voice continued with absolute, chilling authority. That single scout is bait. Do not push the tree line. Acknowledge. Over. The silence that followed was agonizing, filled only by the buzzing insects and the heavy breathing of frightened men. Brennan slowly lowered his hand, signaling his tense squad leaders to hold their precarious positions in the sweltering grass. The sudden realization that they had been mere seconds away from charging headlong into a concentrated kill zone hit him with the physical force of a sledgehammer. His heart hammered violently against his ribs, not from the thrill of the hunt, but from the cold terror of near annihilation. The American sergeant looked at the distant, motionless scout again, suddenly seeing the terrain not as a battlefield to be conquered, but as a complex, deadly puzzle designed by a patient executioner. For the first time in his deployment, Brennan genuinely comprehended the lethal inadequacy of his conventional training in this specific theater of operations. The enemy was not playing by the established rules of maneuver warfare that had liberated Europe. They were fighting an entirely different, microscopic war of survival and attrition. By moving forward loudly and aggressively seeking contact, the heavily armed American platoon had unwittingly transformed themselves into the perfect prey. The Viet Cong did not need to defeat them in open combat. They only needed to bleed them consistently until the political will back home finally collapsed. From his hidden vantage point in the bamboo, Milligan exhaled a long, shaky breath as he watched the American column slowly and methodically break contact, pulling back into a tighter, defensible perimeter. Disaster had been temporarily averted, but the fundamental, systemic problem remained completely unsolved. The American military machine was fundamentally designed to hunt moving targets, completely failing to realize that in the deep jungle canopy, the most dangerous predator is the one who never steps forward. The Australians had learned this bitter lesson decades earlier during the Malayan emergency, paying for that crucial knowledge in Commonwealth blood. What the American troops desperately needed was not more artillery shells or faster extraction helicopters, but a complete psychological unlearning of everything that made them conventional soldiers. Milligan knew that tomorrow, his Australian training team would have to formally introduce Brennan's surviving men to the agonizingly slow, painfully quiet art of counter-tracking. They had to teach these brave but loud Americans how to completely vanish into the hostile foliage, how to read microscopic disturbances in the dirt, and most importantly, how to understand that the true hunters in this brutal environment were the ones who always move backwards. The brutal reality of this asymmetrical conflict was beginning to dawn on the exhausted infantrymen sweating in the tall grass. They had been aggressively chasing fleeting shadows across the province, burning immense calories and expending massive amounts of ammunition, while the shadows simply watched them from the cool dark. The Viet Cong logistics network remained entirely intact, their patience infinitely greater than the American deployment cycles. If they were ever going to actually win this invisible war, they needed to fundamentally change their entire operational geometry. It was time to stop walking blindly into well-laid traps and start building them. As the stifling afternoon sun began its slow descent behind the jagged mountains, casting long, menacing shadows across the valley floor, the jungle seemed to swallow the isolated platoon. They were no longer the confident apex predators defined by Westmoreland's aggressive doctrine. They were surviving students in an unforgiving, ancient classroom. Brennan tightened his grip on his rifle, the sweat finally drying on his deeply tanned forearms. He silently thanked the unseen Australian voice on the radio, fully realizing that their true education in the dark, bloody art of jungle warfare had just begun in the most terrifying way possible. Far from the suffocating humidity of Phuoc Tuy, the air-conditioned briefing rooms of Military Assistance Command Vietnam in Saigon presented a distinctly different war. Here, Major General William Westmoreland meticulously charted the conflict through a prism of industrial efficiency and overwhelming logistical dominance. Maps were neatly divided into grid squares, each representing a mathematically calculated sector for search and destroy operations. The American command staff, impeccably dressed and heavily caffeinated, viewed the insurgency as a complex but solvable equation. They firmly believed that superior firepower, applied consistently, would inevitably shatter the enemy's operational capacity and force a decisive surrender. This unyielding confidence was not born of arrogance, but of historical precedent. The American military doctrine had been violently forged in the mechanized meat grinders of the Second World War and further tempered on the frozen ridges of Korea. It was an offensive philosophy built upon the rapid mobilization of massive armored columns, devastating artillery barrages, and unparalleled aerial bombardment. When American officers looked at the dense Vietnamese canopy, they instinctively sought ways to strip it away, to create recognizable front lines where their immense industrial might could be brought to bear against concentrated enemy troop formations. The cornerstone of this modern strategy was the Huey helicopter, a technological marvel that promised unprecedented battlefield mobility. American commanders envisioned air-mobile infantry leaping over impossible terrain, dropping directly onto suspected enemy staging areas to initiate immediate, decisive combat. Success was coldly measured in daily body counts and weapons captured, metrics that looked incredibly impressive on glossy briefing charts. However, this heavy reliance on aviation completely ignored the deafening acoustic footprint of the aircraft. Long before the first American boot touched the landing zone, the unmistakable roar of rotor blades gave the enemy ample time to disappear. What the metric-driven analysts in Saigon fundamentally failed to grasp was the harsh reality of the enemy's strategic objective. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army were not fighting to hold specific terrain or to win glorious set-piece battles. Their primary mission was simply to survive the terrible American war machine long enough to make the United States political establishment quit. By refusing to mass their forces as conventional targets, they systematically neutralized America's overwhelming artillery advantage. They absorbed the staggering casualties, treating them as an acceptable cost of doing business in a generational war of bloody attrition. Operating in the stark shadow of this massive conventional apparatus was Colonel Ted Sarong, the pragmatic commander of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam. Sarong walked the halls of MACV with a quiet, observant skepticism. He recognized immediately that the American tactics, while brilliantly executed by brave men, were completely unsuited for the specific environmental and psychological realities of the theater. His small contingent of highly specialized warrant officers and captains had not arrived with fleets of helicopters or batteries of heavy howitzers. Instead, they brought a wealth of hard-earned institutional knowledge regarding the grim mechanics of jungle counterinsurgency. The foundation of this Australian expertise had been brutally laid during the Malayan Emergency, a protracted 12-year conflict against communist insurgents operating in similar equatorial rainforests. British and Commonwealth forces had initially attempted large-scale, conventional sweeps, only to suffer humiliating setbacks and mounting casualties. Forced to adapt, they gradually developed a patient, deeply methodical approach to jungle warfare. They learned to operate in incredibly small, autonomous patrols, severing their reliance on noisy supply lines. They survived by becoming intimately familiar with the microterrain, tracking the insurgents relentlessly until they could strike them at their most vulnerable logistical points. Australian doctrine completely rejected the concept of searching blindly to provoke contact. Instead, they deployed 4 to 6 man special air service patrols that would infiltrate silently on foot and remain submerged in the jungle for weeks at a time. These men carried everything they needed on their backs, deliberately denying the enemy the opportunity to ambush vulnerable supply convoys. Their primary weapon was not the rifle, but the radio, and their own unyielding patience. They operated on the strict principle that intelligence gathering was infinitely more valuable than engaging in a chaotic, reactive firefight that yielded minimal strategic results. The central pillar of their tactical methodology was the agonizing art of counter-tracking. American units generally looked for the enemy, while Australian units looked for the subtle signs of enemy passage. A scuffed root, a freshly broken spiderweb, or the unnatural displacement of dead leaves told a trained tracker exactly how many men had passed, how fast they were moving, and what they were carrying. The goal was never to sprint forward and catch the enemy from behind. Instead, it was to determine their intended destination, maneuver quietly through the dense foliage, and establish a deadly trap ahead. The friction between these two military philosophies was immediate and intense. The American approach relied heavily on industrial scale, using massive formations that generated a tremendous logistical tail. A standard U.S. infantry battalion required constant resupply by air, generating continuous noise that echoed for miles across the valleys. They carried heavy helmets, bulky flak jackets, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition, preparing for sustained, violent engagements. In contrast, the Australians wore soft bush hats, carried minimal rations, and silenced every piece of their equipment with tape. They accepted higher personal vulnerability in exchange for absolute tactical stealth. During joint briefings, the cultural disconnect between the Allied commanders was often palpable. Colonel Sarong frequently found himself politely challenging the foundational assumptions of his American counterparts. In conventional warfare, Sarong famously explained to a room full of skeptical colonels, "You advance toward the enemy with maximum force. In jungle counterinsurgency, you get ahead of the enemy and wait." This radical concept challenged the core identity of the American infantryman, who had been aggressively conditioned to close with and destroy the enemy. Asking them to sit quietly in the mud for days felt completely counterintuitive, even cowardly. The American commanders were under immense political pressure to produce immediate, quantifiable results. Slowly tracking a 10-man Viet Cong resupply element for 3 days did not generate the impressive body counts required by the Pentagon's insatiable public relations machine. The math simply did not make sense to officers managing division-sized assets. They argued that their aggressive sweeps, while noisy, consistently flushed the enemy out of hiding and allowed supporting arms to obliterate them. From a purely statistical standpoint, the U.S. strategy seemed to be working, as they were officially killing insurgents at a seemingly unsustainable rate every single month. Yet, the harsh reality on the ground stubbornly contradicted the optimistic briefing charts in Saigon. The Viet Cong quickly adapted to the predictable rhythms of American airmobile operations. They established elaborate early warning networks, utilizing civilian spotters and primitive acoustic devices to track the incoming helicopters. When an American battalion landed, the local guerrilla forces simply buried their heavy weapons and faded into the dense civilian population. Once the noisy Americans declared the area pacified and finally extracted back to their fortified base camps, the insurgents immediately returned, violently reasserting their control over the terrified local villages. Furthermore, the Viet Cong weaponized the American logistical footprint against them. The heavy reliance on established trails and the predictable need for helicopter landing zones made U.S. movements tragically easy to anticipate. Guerrilla commanders instructed their troops to carefully observe the noisy American columns, accurately mapping their patrol routes. They then seeded these known paths with incredibly lethal booby traps and initiated devastating mechanical ambushes. The American soldiers, burdened by their heavy gear and focused on maintaining their rigid formations, frequently walked blindly into these invisible meat grinders, suffering terrible casualties without ever seeing a single enemy combatant. The psychological toll on the conventional troops was devastating. They were brave men, willing to fight, but they were being slowly bled out by an enemy who refused to stand and fight fairly. The constant, gnawing anxiety of stepping on a hidden mine, coupled with the frustrating inability to retaliate, severely degraded unit morale. They felt like they were punching aggressively into thin air, only to be stabbed repeatedly in the back. The friction of the jungle environment, the relentless heat, the debilitating diseases, and the sheer exhaustion of hacking through vines amplified their profound sense of strategic impotence. Colonel Sarong and his advisors understood this psychological degradation perfectly. They knew that a military force cannot maintain offensive spirit indefinitely when it feels continuously hunted by an invisible adversary. The Australian solution was not to increase the volume of artillery fire, but to completely invert the psychological dynamic of the battlefield. By adopting stealth and extreme patience, they forced the Viet Cong to experience the exact same terrifying uncertainty. When insurgents realized that their own secret trails were no longer safe, that silent killers could be waiting behind any bush, their operational tempo drastically slowed down. This was the cruel, unglamorous reality of the shadow war that the AATTV was trying to impart to their American allies. It required stripping away the comforting illusion of technological supremacy and embracing the brutal, primal mechanics of the hunt. Soldiers had to learn how to endure crippling muscle cramps without shifting their weight, how to ignore biting ants swarming over their faces, and how to communicate complex tactical maneuvers using only infinitesimal hand gestures. This level of extreme discipline could not be taught in a massive boot camp. It had to be forged slowly in the jungle. Despite the heavy institutional resistance from ACV, some American junior officers on the front lines began to recognize the undeniable truth in the Australian methodology. They saw that the elite SAS patrols operating in their sectors were consistently returning with vital intelligence and suffering virtually zero casualties, while regular U.S. infantry companies were being decimated by sniper fire and tripwires. These young captains and lieutenants, burdened by the heavy responsibility of keeping their drafted men alive, started seeking out the quiet Australian warrant officers. They asked hard questions, willing to abandon their established doctrine if it meant survival. The transition was incredibly painful and full of operational friction. Retraining an American infantry platoon meant breaking down years of ingrained, aggressive habits. Soldiers accustomed to communicating loudly over radios had to learn the terrifying absolute silence of a listening post. They had to discard their clanking canteens, tape their dog tags, and learn to walk by rolling their feet carefully from heel to toe, feeling for hidden tripwires before committing their body weight. The sheer physical exhaustion of moving only 1 kilometer in 8 hours was often worse than sprinting through a chaotic, raging firefight under fire. As the calendar turned from 1966 into 1967, this quiet revolution in tactical thinking slowly began to spread through specific American units stationed near the Australian task force areas. It was not a widespread doctrinal shift endorsed by Westmoreland, but rather a desperate, localized adaptation driven by the immediate necessity of survival. The jungle canopy, completely indifferent to the political grandstanding in Saigon or Washington, served as the ultimate, unforgiving arbiter of military effectiveness. The men bleeding on the ground realized that victory here would not be achieved by moving faster, but by learning how to stand absolutely still. This localized integration of Australian tactics highlighted a profound paradox within the American war effort. The most heavily industrialized military in human history found itself utterly dependent on the primal, ancient skills of wilderness trackers to neutralize a peasant army. The sophisticated computers in the Pentagon could accurately calculate the precise trajectory of a cruise missile, but they could not teach a terrified teenager from Detroit how to smell a hidden Viet Cong tunnel complex. The true center of gravity in this brutal conflict resided not in the sky, but in the dense, claustrophobic mud of the jungle floor. For officers like Captain Bob Milligan, watching the Americans slowly adapt was a source of both immense pride and lingering sorrow. He knew that mastering these silent, deadly arts would undoubtedly save countless American lives in the immediate tactical engagements ahead. However, he also grasped the darker strategic reality that the metrics-obsessed generals in Saigon consistently ignored. The Viet Cong were perfectly willing to absorb horrific losses to buy precious time. Teaching the Americans how to become better, quieter killers in the deep jungle might win the localized battles, but it could never single-handedly salvage a deeply flawed war. January 1967 brought a miserable, cloying dampness to the dense jungle canopy surrounding Suoi Da Creek in Phuoc Tuy Province. Captain Jim Hughes of Charlie Company, 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment, wiped a mixture of grim sweat and foul mud from his exhausted face. He had been commanding combat patrols in this hostile country for 4 grueling months, and his deep frustration was nearing a boiling point. His seasoned company had run dozens of aggressive sweeps, continuously tallying a respectable body count. Yet the local Viet Cong forces seemingly multiplied like insidious jungle mosquitoes in their wake. The fundamental problem was infuriatingly simple to observe but seemingly impossible to physically rectify on the dense battlefield. Hughes possessed highly experienced platoon leaders and remarkably well-trained riflemen, yet his conventional American unit was constantly reacting rather than dictating the fight. They killed 3 hardened insurgents in a chaotic firefight, only to have 5 heavily armed replacements materialize from the impenetrable foliage the very next morning. That humid afternoon, a thoroughly exhausted Hughes sat in on a highly unusual tactical briefing delivered by Captain Bob Grandin, a quietly confident veteran of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment. Grandin's small, specialized reconnaissance patrol had just spent 11 agonizing days silently tracking a dedicated Viet Cong logistics unit directly through the exact same sector where Charlie Company had been loudly operating. Often, the Australian trackers were moving just a few hours or even mere minutes behind the heavily burdened American infantrymen. "You have been walking right past them for weeks," Grandin stated plainly, spreading out grainy black and white reconnaissance photographs across the makeshift wooden briefing table. The images displayed distinctly disturbed vegetation, carefully snapped twigs, and incredibly subtle trail markers that the American soldiers had completely overlooked. Hughes instantly bristled at the blunt, seemingly condescending professional assessment from the Allied foreign officer. He proudly defended his men, sternly reminding Grandin that Charlie Company rigorously utilized proper noise discipline, strictly moved in staggered column formations, and heavily employed dedicated point security elements. "We are following standard infantry doctrine to the letter," Hughes argued, his voice tight with defensive exhaustion. "American doctrine works brilliantly on the plains of Europe," Grandin replied evenly, completely unbothered by the Americans' rising temper. "But Charlie is not playing that conventional game. Let me show your men something entirely different." Early the very next morning, beneath a thick, suffocating blanket of gray monsoon clouds, Grandin took Hughes and 2 of his most trusted platoon leaders on a radically different type of jungle patrol. For the first excruciating hour of the mission, the combined element covered a frustratingly short distance of less than 300 meters. Every 10 agonizing minutes, Grandin would signal the entire patrol to halt completely, enforcing 5 agonizing minutes of absolute, terrifyingly silent observation. The Americans strained their bloodshot eyes, desperately trying to pierce the deep, deceiving shadows of the ancient, rotting bamboo groves. During these painfully long, silent pauses, the physical friction of this new warfare became immediately and violently apparent to the American officers. The intense urge to aggressively swat away the relentlessly biting jungle mosquitoes had to be brutally suppressed through sheer willpower. Cramping calf muscles screamed for relief. But shifting weight meant creating unnatural, dangerous noise. Grandin slowly pointed out, barely visible, microscopic disturbances buried deep in the rotting undergrowth. He indicated a single snapped twig precisely at ankle height, a microscopic smudge of discolored mud on a broad leaf, and a small stone turned wet side up. The Viet Cong patrol, likely 8 to 10 heavily burdened men, moved steadily through this exact location between 0300 and 0400 hours this morning. Grandin whispered, his voice barely a breath. "They are moving deliberately northeast, probably navigating toward a hidden subterranean cache site located near the winding creek." Hughes stared at the damp, seemingly undisturbed dirt, deeply skeptical of this almost supernatural tactical deduction. "How can you possibly know that level of specific detail?" The American captain challenged softly, desperately wanting to believe but heavily anchored by his conventional military training. Grandin patiently pointed a calloused finger down at the incredibly faint, overlapping tracks pressed into the soft, yielding mud. "Look closely at the specific depth and the irregular spacing of those boot impressions," the Australian tracker instructed quietly. "They are carrying exceptionally heavy logistical loads, probably bulk rice or heavy machine gun ammunition. The walking gait is highly purposeful and direct, definitively not a cautious tactical patrol." He then carefully indicated a subtle spot where the narrow jungle trail split in 2 directions. "Notice they deliberately took the much easier, well-trodden path here instead of the brush. Men operating under strict tactical conditions will almost always take the harder, physically demanding path because it offers significantly better concealment," Grandin explained, his eyes constantly scanning the dense green wall ahead. "Men burdened on a routine logistics run will naturally take the significantly faster, easier route to conserve their burning calories." Over the next 3 grueling hours, Grandin painstakingly tracked the invisible Viet Cong logistics patrol to within 500 meters of a heavily concealed subterranean cache site. Instead of launching a hasty, aggressive infantry assault, he quietly documented the exact map coordinates and completely withdrew. 2 tense days later, a heavily armed, 5-man Australian SAS team successfully ambushed that exact logistical cache site in the dead of night. They ruthlessly eliminated 6 hardened Viet Cong fighters and officially captured 3 tons of vital rice and smuggled weapons, sustaining absolutely 0 friendly casualties during the brief, violent engagement. Hughes was thoroughly and permanently converted by the undeniable, blood-soaked results. "You weren't blindly hunting them," the American captain admitted during their subsequent debriefing, a profound sense of awe coloring his exhausted voice. "You were systematically herding them into a prepared, inescapable slaughterhouse." This grim, fundamental realization that the unforgiving jungle war required hyper-specialized predator skills rather than loud, conventional warrior instincts slowly began to spread. It deeply infected the select American infantry units that were remarkably fortunate enough to work closely with the veteran Australian advisors. However, adapting to this brutal new reality required a monumental, almost impossible psychological shift for the young, aggressively conditioned American soldiers. They had to completely unlearn everything drilled into them at Fort Benning, willingly embracing the terrifying vulnerability of moving slowly and silently through a landscape designed to violently kill them without warning. Retraining an American infantry platoon meant enforcing a level of micromanagement that bordered on the absurd, generating immense internal friction. Every single piece of issued metallic equipment had to be meticulously secured or heavily wrapped in thick green tape to eliminate any unnatural clinking sounds. Standard plastic canteens were rigidly ordered to be either completely full or entirely empty, absolutely preventing the rhythmic, highly audible sloshing of water that the enemy acoustic networks easily identified. The sharp, terrifying crack of breaking dry vegetation was strictly avoided, even if it meant taking twice as long to navigate a simple slope. More profoundly, they were meticulously taught how to deliberately think like a vulnerable prey animal navigating a forest of wolves. American military doctrine fundamentally taught its young soldiers to be aggressively proactive, to immediately seize the tactical initiative, and to violently close with the hostile enemy forces. Australian doctrine violently subverted this, teaching them to see the terrain without ever being seen, to instinctively sense impending danger long before it physically materialized. They learned to weaponize the enemy's own established expectations, turning the Viet Cong's supreme confidence in their hidden jungle trails into a fatal, inescapable weakness. The friction of this transformation was deeply psychological as well as intensely physical, breaking down men who thought they were already hardened. Standing absolutely still for hours while insects ravaged exposed skin required a type of masochistic discipline that conventional boot camps never instilled. The American soldiers who managed to survive this grueling Australian curriculum emerged fundamentally changed, their eyes carrying the cold, calculating stare of men who had learned to manipulate shadows. They were no longer the loud, clumsy bait wandering through the green hell. They were slowly, painfully evolving into the very monsters the enemy feared. April 23, 1967, marked the grueling initiation of Operation Ingham in the unforgiving depths of Phuoc Tuy Province. Lieutenant Mike Berghoff commanded the 2nd Platoon, heavily attached to an Australian operational element for the very first time. His exhausted American soldiers had just completed 3 intensive days of specialized instruction under Warrant Officer Brian Wickens of the Australian SAS. They were meticulously taught the punishing arts of counter-tracking, sign reading, and the excruciating discipline of the backward patrol. The dense jungle canopy above them completely blocked out the harsh sun, creating a suffocating, insect-ridden twilight. "Everything your unit has been doing out here is entirely reactive," Wickens explained quietly to Berghoff during their final, tense briefing. "You loudly patrol the jungle until you inevitably get hit, and then you react blindly with overwhelming firepower. We are going to teach your men how to be proactive, how to know exactly where Charlie is before he ever realizes you are there." This radical shift in tactical mindset required Berghoff's men to completely abandon their ingrained American doctrine. They had to willingly embrace the terrifying vulnerability of extreme patience and absolute silence. The physical friction of establishing their concealed ambush position was immediately agonizing for the heavily burdened American infantrymen. They spent hours painstakingly crawling into a dense thicket overlooking a suspected Viet Cong supply trail, moving only inches at a time. Every single piece of metallic gear had been aggressively taped, and canteens were half-filled to prevent any unnatural sloshing. The terrifying crack of a single breaking twig could instantly compromise their position and invite a devastating mortar barrage. They settled into the rotting, insect-infested mud, mentally preparing themselves for an excruciatingly long, silent wait. For the next 36 hours, Berghoff's disciplined platoon endured a psychological and physical torment that no conventional boot camp could ever replicate. They communicated exclusively through infinitesimal hand signals, their weary eyes constantly scanning the deceiving shadows of the dark trail. Eating cold, tasteless rations without making a sound required immense concentration, while smoking was absolutely forbidden. The relentless jungle mosquitoes viciously swarmed their exposed faces and hands, but the men had to ruthlessly suppress the overwhelming urge to swat them. Shifting cramping muscles meant risking the rustle of fabric that the enemy might hear. The psychological toll of this forced paralysis was incredibly severe, amplifying the creeping terror of friendly fire in the pitch-black jungle night. The Viet Cong were actively adapting to these new, highly dangerous American units, abandoning established paths and utilizing advanced scouting elements. Captured enemy documents had recently warned guerrilla commanders about these specific American patrols that moved silently like hunters instead of noisy conventional troops. Berghoff knew that if an enemy scout detected their hidden position, the main Viet Cong force would silently flank them and annihilate his trapped platoon in the dark. At exactly 04:15 on the second exhausting night, the oppressive silence of the jungle was finally broken by subtle movement. A disciplined Viet Cong patrol consisting of 11 heavily armed men slowly materialized from the impenetrable darkness, walking down the muddy trail. They were murmuring quietly to one another, their deadly automatic weapons casually slung over their slender shoulders. The guerrillas clearly believed they were operating in a completely secure area, as noisy American forces had aggressively swept this exact grid square just 4 days prior without finding absolutely anything of value. Berghoff's heart hammered violently against his ribs as he watched the unsuspecting enemy fighters walk directly into his meticulously prepared kill zone. The American lieutenant waited until the entire Viet Cong formation was perfectly bracketed by his hidden explosives before squeezing the firing device. The dense jungle erupted in a deafening, blinding storm of lethal shrapnel as the directional claymore mines detonated simultaneously. The concussive blast instantly shattered the serene night, immediately followed by the terrifying, sustained roar of point-blank American machine gun fire tearing through the panicked, disoriented ranks of the enemy patrol. The brutal, one-sided engagement lasted exactly 47 seconds before the ringing silence violently reclaimed the smoking, blood-soaked jungle floor. 11 Viet Cong fighters lay dead among the shredded vegetation, including a high-ranking company commander carrying vital maps and intelligence documents. The chaotic Hollywood glamour of warfare was completely absent here. There was only the cold, mechanical efficiency of a perfectly executed trap. Berghoff's thoroughly exhausted platoon secured the grisly perimeter, their ears ringing painfully from the sudden cordite explosion. Miraculously, the American unit had sustained absolutely zero casualties during the brief, devastatingly violent nocturnal encounter. We had walked loudly down that exact same muddy trail 5 distinct times in the past month, Berghoff later documented in his official after-action report. Every single time we aggressively pushed through, we made noise, and Charlie simply faded away into the trees. This time, we intentionally did it backwards. We quietly got there first, we maintained absolute silence, and we let Charlie walk directly into our guns. The young lieutenant realized that while this passive approach felt inherently wrong and cowardly to a conventionally trained soldier, it was undeniably the most lethal tactic available. Despite these undeniable tactical triumphs, the widespread diffusion of this Australian methodology throughout the massive American military apparatus remained frustratingly uneven. Many senior commanders rigidly resisted these unconventional changes, fundamentally misunderstanding the deep psychological discipline required to execute them properly. The patient, highly methodical approach completely failed to produce the massive, daily body counts that the Pentagon's insatiable metrics blindly demanded. Division-level officers argued that you simply could not scale these quiet, squad-level ambush tactics into the massive battalion-sized operations required to pacify entire hostile provinces and appease the impatient politicians back in Washington. Furthermore, the deeply resourceful enemy forces were not merely passive victims to these deadly new American tactical adaptations. As select Allied units became increasingly lethal, the Viet Cong intelligence networks grew highly sophisticated at rapidly identifying which specific American patrols utilized Australian methods. They deliberately countered by aggressively laying false trails in the mud, carefully designing deceptive signs meant to lure overconfident Allied tracking teams into massive, pre-positioned kill zones. The brutal shadow war beneath the dense canopy devolved into a terrifying, high-stakes game of microscopic chess, where the slightest miscalculation meant immediate, violent death. The American units that fully embraced the brutal friction of the jungle and mastered these silent arts became undeniably formidable predators. They successfully reduced their own casualties while dramatically increasing their lethality, proving that the Australian doctrine was fundamentally correct for this environment. However, this localized tactical brilliance masked a terrifying, looming strategic catastrophe that no amount of perfectly executed ambushes could ever hope to prevent. The young soldiers were finally learning exactly how to win the deadly knife fights in the dark. But the massive, overarching war itself was already being quietly lost elsewhere. When the massive Tet Offensive unexpectedly exploded across South Vietnam on January 30th, 1968, American and Allied forces responded with devastating, conventional effectiveness. The sudden, coordinated assault proved to be a catastrophic military miscalculation for the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army. They abandoned their careful guerrilla tactics to launch massive conventional strikes against fortified urban centers, suffering an estimated 45,000 casualties in a matter of weeks. The insurgents failed to hold any of their primary objectives beyond a few bloody days, utterly shattered by the overwhelming industrial firepower that the United States military finally unleashed. During this chaotic period of intense, widespread urban combat, the specific American units that had rigorously trained in Australian jungle tactics performed exceptionally well. The 173rd Airborne Brigade, operating primarily in the Central Highlands, utilized their highly refined counter-ambush skills to systematically dismantle retreating enemy columns with minimal friendly casualties. Australian task forces situated in Phuoc Tuy Province essentially annihilated local insurgent battalions that foolishly attempted to assault the heavily fortified district capitals. These specialized troops demonstrated that extreme patience and rigorous fire discipline were just as lethal in defensive urban sieges as they were in the remote jungle. Yet, the smoking ruins of the Tet Offensive brutally revealed the central, tragic truth of the entire Vietnam conflict. Tactical military effectiveness meant absolutely nothing without a coherent, sustainable political strategy. The American military apparatus had become extraordinarily proficient at locating and killing the enemy, and the localized Australian tactical innovations had made specific Allied units even deadlier. However, despite the staggering enemy body count, the Communist forces simply kept coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Simultaneously, the crucial political will of the American public at home was rapidly crumbling under the relentless weight of televised casualties. General Creighton Abrams formally replaced Westmoreland as the Supreme Commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam in June 1968, immediately recognizing this grim strategic reality. He desperately attempted to shift the overarching American strategy away from noisy search and destroy missions toward methodical clear and hold operations. Ironically, Abrams actively tried to mandate the widespread adoption of the patient, intelligence-driven Australian tactical methods throughout the entire American conventional military hierarchy. New training programs heavily based on these specialized tracking and ambush techniques were hastily established at various division and brigade levels across the fractured country, aiming to reduce the terrible Allied attrition rate. Unfortunately, this massive institutional shift in tactical doctrine arrived far too late to alter the geopolitical outcome of the war. By the time these refined combat techniques were being formally integrated into standard American operating procedures, domestic support for the prolonged conflict had entirely collapsed. The pressing question within the halls of the Pentagon was no longer how to achieve a decisive military victory, but rather how to expedite a complete withdrawal without suffering absolute humiliation. The brutal friction of the battlefield was officially being replaced by the cynical, calculated friction of international diplomacy and rapid military Vietnamization. Staff Sergeant Mike Brennan, the exhausted infantryman frozen in the sweltering elephant grass back in August 1966, remarkably survived his first harrowing tour in Vietnam. Instead of returning to the safety of the United States, he voluntarily extended his combat deployment specifically to master the specialized tracking techniques he had witnessed. Brennan eventually became a highly respected instructor, dedicating his second tour to teaching young, terrified American draftees how to survive the lethal canopy. He relentlessly drilled them on the agonizing discipline of silent movement, desperately trying to keep them alive in a war that was already strategically doomed. The Australians explicitly showed us that we had been doing it entirely backwards, Brennan reflected during a somber, retrospective interview decades after the conflict. We were brave and well-trained, but we were foolishly playing the enemy's chosen game. We would loudly walk into a hostile sector, practically announcing our presence, and simply wait for Charlie to initiate the fight on his terms. The Aussies taught us the agonizing patience required to completely flip that script. We learned how to quietly arrive first, become entirely invisible, and brutally force the enemy to blindly walk directly into our prepared guns. The statistical evidence gathered from these specialized units was undeniably compelling and heavily documented by MACV analysts. American infantry companies that fully embraced the brutal, slow-moving Australian methodology suffered 65% fewer casualties from mechanical ambushes and hidden booby traps. Furthermore, they consistently produced a confirmed kill ratio that tripled the performance of standard, conventionally operating units. They proved beyond any reasonable doubt that the patient, intelligence-driven approach to jungle counterinsurgency was vastly superior to the noisy application of blind firepower. Yet, this localized excellence only served to highlight the overarching tragedy of the entire American military intervention. This profound historical paradox remains a bitter lesson in the fundamental limitations of military power. You can successfully train a conventional rifle platoon to flawlessly execute the most complex, silent ambush in the darkest rainforest, but superior battlefield tactics can never overcome a fundamentally flawed national strategy. The patient, methodical Australian approach to unconventional warfare was ultimately incompatible with an American institutional culture that demanded immediate, quantifiable results. The Pentagon's relentless obsession with daily body counts and territory control entirely blinded them to the invisible, psychological degradation of the enemy infrastructure that the AATTV advisors prioritized above all else. The hard-earned tactical lessons forged in the bloody mud of Phuoc Tuy province did eventually influence future generations of modern warfighters. Elite Special Operations Forces heavily incorporated these precise tracking methodologies and small unit ambush tactics into their foundational training doctrines. Decades later, these exact same silent disciplines proved incredibly valuable in the harsh deserts of Iraq and the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, where coalition forces again faced deeply entrenched insurgencies. However, the fundamental tragic error often persisted among senior leadership: the dangerous belief that localized tactical excellence could somehow serve as a functional substitute for a coherent geopolitical strategy. In late April 1975, as the chaotic final evacuation of Saigon played out on international television, Captain Bob Milligan watched from afar with a heavy heart. The veteran Australian officer had survived 3 brutal combat tours in Southeast Asia, dedicating years to systematically training American and South Vietnamese forces. He had personally witnessed the remarkable tactical evolution of units that learned to hunt like silent predators, dramatically reducing their own suffering while inflicting terrible damage on the enemy. Yet, he was now forced to watch the total, undeniable collapse of the very nation they had all fought to defend. We successfully taught your young men how to become vastly superior soldiers in the darkest jungle, Milligan wrote in a deeply poignant letter to a former American student just days after the South Vietnamese capital fell. You learned those brutal lessons exceptionally well, and some of you undoubtedly became the finest, most lethal jungle fighters in the world. But we simply could not teach your politicians to want a decisive victory more than the leadership of North Vietnam wanted it. That was the only strategic lesson that truly mattered in the end, and it simply could not be taught. The horrifying ambush that Brennan's exposed platoon was about to blindly walk into on that sweltering August morning in 1966 never actually occurred. Captain Milligan had forcefully broken strict radio silence, deliberately risking his own hidden team to warn the American commander and redirect their doomed advance. 2 tense days later, a fully integrated Allied patrol quietly caught that exact same Viet Cong unit completely exposed in the open. Operating with cold, silent efficiency, they ruthlessly eliminated 17 hardened guerrillas without sustaining a single friendly casualty, perfectly validating the lethal superiority of the patient, backward-moving jungle ambush. Sergeant Brennan ultimately survived his grueling combat tours and returned home precisely because he learned how to adapt to the terrifying friction of the jungle. He survived because he abandoned the arrogant illusion of conventional military dominance and embraced the humble, agonizing reality of the invisible prey. The dedicated Australian advisors successfully taught a generation of American infantrymen how to become far deadlier hunters in a deeply hostile environment. They mastered the quiet art of moving backwards, eliminating their enemies with terrifying precision. But the massive, grinding war was ultimately lost anyway by the men in the tailored suits.